Welcome to Vision Heart blog number 6. I'm Richard Warner, and we're continuing on from the last video where we were discussing cracking the shell of the ego, cracking the egg of the shell, the barrier around ourselves which keeps us contained as an individual self, and so on. Now that is something that we need, and we talked also about that shell also in another metaphor of being a membrane of a cell, and the individual self sitting inside the cellular membrane being the ego, which is necessary to allow things in and to eliminate other things. And the ego as a membrane acts as an intelligent device that knows what's good for it and allows those things to come in, and knows what's bad for it and finds a way to get those things out of the cell, and so on. So that healthy give and take, that membrane metaphor, is actually a very healthy analogy for the ego. But the ego can, in the terms of Joseph Chilton Pearce, become a very hard-shelled egg around ourselves and contains us. Now, if nothing's coming in and nothing's going out, you build up toxicity on the inside, and so on, and nothing good can come in. So, from the outside. One of the classic scenarios of this is this breaking down of the ego, if it has to be broken, as we talked about with that Hindu gesture in front of a Ganesha shrine of banging the head and asking Ganesha to break my ego, to break my hard shell, to open me up to your grace, sort of thing, or the beneficial influence of something coming in from beyond, outside of the small ego. There are classic cases of this in all the spiritual literature, and just about any lineage that you can think of. The famous story of Milarepa in Tibet. One of the most striking examples of this is Carlos Castaneda's initial book, The Teachings of Don Juan, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge, is pretty much about, the whole first book is pretty much about Don Juan's breaking down the hard-shell ego of Carlos Castaneda's mindset. Castaneda came to Don Juan, if folk don't really know the story or haven't read Castaneda. Carlos Castaneda was an anthropology student at the University of California, and he wanted to do a study of the use of hallucinogenic or psychotropic plants in the hands of various native cultures in the southwestern United States and bordering into Mexico. He came upon Don Juan by accident, so to speak, and Don Juan decided to take him on as an apprentice. Carlos Castaneda not really realizing what he was getting into, but the entire first book of Carlos Castaneda's many books, especially the first 4, was a process of breaking down. Don Juan, one might say mercilessly, but there was a lot of love and compassion there. But Don Juan, knowing that Castaneda's ego was very hard, very fixed. He was an academic student, he thought in academic ways, a very fixed, rigid form of thinking, and so on. And he looked at the entire universe in a very academic way, as he was trained to do, and so on. This needed breaking down. If he was actually going to take on the role of the sorcerer, or a man of knowledge, in Don Juan's terms, probably the better term rather than sorcerer. It has a lot of negative or spooky connotations in the Western context. Don Juan preferred to use the word man of knowledge. So a man of knowledge has to be broken down. Someone who understands that they need to learn more, who wishes to learn more, who needs to open up more, understands that that hard-shelled ego, that fixed idea, that fixed view of the universe has to be broken down. And in most cases it has to be broken down. It's not something that most of us are willing to let go of. That's a very enlightened person who understands what needs to be let go of and just lets go. It usually has to be broken down. It doesn't have to be a violent procedure. I think the more one resists, the more strength, shall we say, has to be used to break that down. So we have Castaneda as a student meeting Don Juan and being put through a series of trials and tribulations, some of them actually quite frightening when you read the books and so on. But this was all necessary, and it wasn't until probably pretty much through the second book that Castaneda started to understand why he was being treated this way, why he couldn't seem to pull himself away from his apprenticeship, and yet it was a painful process for him. So opening ourselves up to another way, to other views and so on, is not an easy process. And anyone who thinks it is fooling themselves. It requires work. The Buddha once said, the spiritual path, best not to begin. Once begun, best to finish. So this runs contradictory to a lot of people's perception of spiritual things as being airy-fairy or light or lightweight. When one really looks at the spiritual path, one realizes that it's probably the most frightening, the most rigorous, the toughest thing that you could possibly do. Reinventing ourselves, reopening ourselves, getting to that state of innocence, that returning to childhood, in that sense of that kind of complete openness, is really hard work, especially for the Western mind. That because our Western culture is based on building up such a firmly defined, a very fixed idea about who I am. I'm a this kind of person, I'm a that kind of person, I'm this political affiliation, I'm this religious denomination, I'm this, I like this sports team, and so on. We get the picture, we've talked about this. But it runs so deep, and it's so insidious, and its roots go deep, 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 and it's very hard to pull these things up. I was reading an interesting article about the chakras, the human chakras, and the root chakra is considered one of the most difficult ones to work with. It's also the basis of everything. It's called the root, and so on. And the roots go down deep into the earth, into the dark, and so on. And so it's very hard to pull those roots up, but it's necessary to get the roots up and expose them to the light. When we expose those roots to the light and get them out of their earth, so to speak, their grounding, where they've really entrenched themselves in the dark, which is analogous to the subconscious, we can kill the plant off, so to speak, the creeper, the vine, the weed, and so on, of the established, firmly entrenched, denying ego that does so much to make sure that things stay the way they are. Once the unfamiliar starts to creep in, it becomes threatened. We see this in everyday life. We see groups of people who don't want to let go, and when their roots are exposed, start to thrash about. So this seems to be a very necessary process, and it's one that's not taken lightly. But once it's begun, this is where freedom begins.